Hello, and welcome to the question and answer edition of the Thriving Kids podcast from the Child Mind Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. Last week, I spoke with Dr. Angela Glimp, CEO of the Peer Health Exchange, about one of the most important and sometimes one of the most uncomfortable topics for parents: how to talk with kids about sex, safety, and consent. We explored how early, open conversations can help kids make better choices, why modeling respect and boundaries in everyday life really matters, and how the talk isn't just one big moment. It's an ongoing dialogue that grows with your child. This week, I'll be answering your questions about how to keep those conversations going at home, from curiosity and online exposure to consent, privacy, and what's actually age appropriate. Let's get into it. Our first question for the Thriving Kids Q&A episode this week on sex, consent, and safety is, when's the right time to start talking to kids about sex and consent? I don't want to wait too long, but I also don't want to overexpose them before they're ready. I love the way that this question is phrased in kind of the second part of it. I don't want to overexpose them before they're ready. What I want to start with is the notion that kids do better when they're not in the dark. So especially with a challenging topic like sex, consent, and safety, we want to give them the information they need coming from their parents at earlier ages than they might encounter this with peers. Mainly because the information they get from peers, or the information that, God forbid, they get from the internet, is probably going to be less reliable and complete than the information they could get from someone who really wants to have the conversation, in an open way and answer some of their questions and make sure they have the information they need. So when we talk about the right time, it's very common for kids in early elementary school to understand how babies are made, or to want to know about the biology of it. That conversation, as Dr. Angela Glimp and I talk about on the podcast, is one that can really start early, where you're kind of talking to kids about what the biology is. You might talk about how a baby's made first. Kids might eventually ask how sperm and egg come together. And as you'll hear on the podcast, we talk about not using euphemisms, being scientific about this. So saying that a baby is made when a sperm and an egg come together, and then that sperm and an egg grow into a baby in mama's uterus. However this conversation might come up with your kids, they can handle that level of information even at very early ages in terms of science. As you get into middle elementary school, kids often ask, how do the sperm and the egg come together? And this can, again, be a biological conversation that can be aided by many books, which we actually recommend a number on our Child Mind Institute website, childmind.org. We will also have a few books that Dr. Glimp has recommended in our show notes for the sex, safety, and consent episode, and that are also adapted to different age ranges. But even in middle elementary school, we might hear kids asking how babies actually do have a sperm and the egg come together. And so we'll talk about not using euphemisms and saying that it's when a penis goes into a vagina and deposits sperm there, where an egg might be coming down from the ovaries. And when those two combine, they start to make a baby. Obviously kids might ask certain questions depending on different family configurations they see around them. If they see single parent families, if they see same gender families, they might ask about how babies are made in those cases. And that's when we get into a little bit more science as well, that some families may have a baby grow in someone else's uterus in order for them to get that baby, or some people might be raising a kid by themselves, even if there was another parent who contributed to the making of that baby. So again, we'll get into those conversations in elementary school. By late elementary school, we're often starting to talk about crushes, romantic relationships, things like that. We don't necessarily expect kids to be engaging in physical intimacy just yet, but it's a really good idea at that stage to kind of start talking to kids about your values, and also about what they might encounter in romantic relationships as they move, say, into the middle school years. And again, we have a number of resources on our website and in our show notes about how to engage in those conversations with kids. What I'll also get to in this question is that consent is another big topic, and that starts in parallel to conversations about the mechanics of sex and then into romantic relationships and physical intimacy. But with consent, we often think about this as an early age in teaching kids about body boundaries. So early elementary school, we might be talking to kids about how they have private areas and how there are only certain people who might be helping them get dressed or asking them about their private areas. It might be a doctor or a parent or caregiver, and that if anyone else asks to see their private areas, they are to say no, or they are to talk to their parent about that. That's a common conversation both in schools and in families about these kind of body boundaries. And as we go forward through kind of middle childhood, late elementary school years, we want to also be having conversations with kids about whether or not, if someone asks for a hug or if someone asks for a high five, that it's obviously their body and they can choose whether or not someone touches them, whether or not someone gives them a hug, whether or not, they want to engage in certain things with other people, certain greetings, things like that. And giving kids choices kind of models for them consent at early ages. Like I'll often say when our family gets together with friends of my 9 or my 6-year-old, just something where as we're saying goodbye, I'll say, listen, do you want a high five, a handshake, a pound? Or if it's someone we know really well, I might say, do you want a hug or a high five? And letting kids kind of elect into that and modeling for them what consent looks like in respect for their body boundaries. As we go forward into the teen years, that's where we kind of level up those conversations and start talking about, you might start getting into romantic relationships. You might have people who have crushes on you, or you might have crushes on people. And here are the ways to kind of respectfully, ask and make sure that you have enthusiastic consent as you're engaging in, say, age appropriate physical acts, and just not to scare anybody. As we talk about in the podcast, what we expect in middle school is that people might be engaging in their first dating relationships. There might be some holding hands. Late middle school, there might be some kissing, things like that. And we can talk to kids about how they communicate with a partner, when getting into those situations. And I know this is a really big first question because it's pretty much an entire podcast episode in and of itself. But I'll also say, if you find yourself screaming, wait, how is it that I have conversations with them? Maybe my kid doesn't want to talk to me about this. I will go back to a fantastic quote from a colleague once where, they said you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be a psychologist talking to your kids about sex, consent, and safety. You just need to be their guide or their conduit to good information. And that's where you might say, look, I know you might have questions about this. Maybe it feels too awkward to talk to me about it, but here are some resources that you can read that I've read. And then if you have any questions about them, I'm happy to talk to you about it and try to get past whatever awkwardness we might feel. Our second question is a doozy for this week. I'm pretty sure my teen has seen porn online, even though we've never talked about it. How do I bring it up without making it awkward and judgmental and help them understand what's healthy versus what's not? There is a lot to unpack in this question. So the first thing is that we often talk to parents when they say, I'm really worried about porn in the same way that parents are really worried about drugs or alcohol. The reality is by the time most kids get to college, they will tell us they've been in situations where drugs were present. They will tell us that they've been in situations where alcohol was present. And they will also tell us they've seen porn online. That's what the research shows. Regardless of kind of where kids grow up or in what communities they grow up, they're generally exposed or have been in those kind of situations. So we don't want to bury our heads in the sand. And it's very important for parents to first kind of think about, when talking about drugs or alcohol or talking about any other sort of risk in adolescence, we can say to our kids, look, I don't want you to do this, but I also want to be realistic about what you might be exposed to. So we might say to our kids, I do not want you to do these internet searches online. I do not want you to be looking at this. At the same time, from what I understand, this is fairly ubiquitous in your generation amongst your peers. I know that there might be some things that you're exposed to. And in the event that you're exposed to it, I think it's really important to kind of put it in context. And that's a big thing about porn. I actually have an article, I believe, in Time a few years back about how to talk to your kid about porn. But here are the basic kind of talking points. What we want to say to kids is obviously we might say, we don't want you to see it. Beyond that, we might say, but I want to be realistic. And then beyond that, we might say, and if you've seen it, I think it's really important to understand that porn is not real. That what you see online is not a real representation of a sexual encounter in a relationship. These are particularly important conversations for adolescent males, where what the research shows is that it's very rare for an adolescent male not to have seen porn. And at the same time, there is research looking at the ways that porn shapes male expectations and attitudes about sex, in the sense that they may be more likely to expect that a partner is into something that they might not be, or that they might be more quickly able to engage in certain things. They may have unrealistic expectations about how much someone might like certain things. They might have unrealistic expectations about the way that an encounter proceeds. They might have unrealistic expectations about what bodies look like, just in general. So there's a lot that we want to talk to kids about what these kinds of things online might shape in terms of our exposure to them and how they shape an attitude or an expectation that teens might have for these situations. And again, you don't have to have the full conversation yourself. There are resources online about these things. As I referenced, I and many of my colleagues have done articles in major media and news sources about how to talk to your kids about porn in kind of a non-judgmental way as much as we possibly can, and while also realizing the craziness of kind of the world we live in, and really understanding how their attitudes and expectations for sexual encounters could be changed by this. So again, you might start having this conversation with a kid. You might be prepared for it. You might be prepared to tell them all the different ways that research shows that their attitudes could change about this. I will also say, just on behalf of some of the female patients I see, one of the things that I think is really important, especially for female patients who either have been exposed to porn or are perhaps having relationships with partners who've been exposed to porn, one thing that I think it's perfectly, or it's really appropriate to tell kids is just that you can tell your partner, I want you to know that the encounter with me is not going to be like porn you might have seen. And that's something we want to authorize kids to think about as a really healthy way of setting boundaries, to say, look, you may have seen some things online. You're now in a real relationship. This is what I expect in terms of your consideration of me, or this is what are my boundaries. This is what I will and don't feel comfortable doing. All of those things are really important to kind of arm kids with going into these conversations, so they don't feel pressure to, say, perform like something that may be their partner's fantasy, or maybe something that they were exposed to online. They can always say, that's online, this is real life, I want you to know what I feel comfortable with. So again, there's a lot of things here about boundaries, about understanding how our online exposure shapes our expectations. These are tough conversations. Look for help. Look for help from online sources. Look for help from parents who've been through this before, or perhaps had these conversations with older kids. And then also just remember that if your kid shuts you down and says, oh my God, this is so cringe, I can't believe you're talking about this, you can say, look, I understand it's cringe. I understand that you may not want to hear this from me. Please just let me send you some things to read about it, and just promise me you'll take a look at it. And if you have any questions, I'm here. Let's figure out how to talk about it. Our next question, which is related to what I just said. My teen completely shuts down when I try to talk about sex. They roll their eyes and call it so awkward. How do I keep the door open when they clearly don't want to engage? Again, as I just said in the response to the previous question, because so many of these topics, we see teens tell us, oh my God, I can't believe you've been bringing this up. I say to a lot of kids in session, just let me be awkward for a second. Just I will try to be as brief as I possibly can be. I'll try to hit my talking points, real quick. I just want to tell you a few things. This is going to relate to a few of the questions later in this episode about how to talk to kids about safety in sexual encounters. But I will just say, oftentimes to patients, I'll get into it and I'll say, look, I don't know if your parents have talked to you about this, but you just have to let me be awkward for a moment and ask you a couple of questions, because I can't tell you the number of times I've been in conversations with patients where they start to tell me about how they're becoming sexually active in, say, late high school years with a partner. And I'll say, has someone talked to you about using protection? And then they'll say, oh yeah, of course, I've had sex ed, or, my mom talked to me about that a little while ago, or my buddies got me covered. And then I'll say to them, we can go the two ways on this. You can tell me what you know, or I can tell you what I know. I just want to make sure you know what I know. And I cannot tell you the number of times when I'm astounded when kids say, I think I can present sexually transmitted infection with soap and water, or good dish soap, where kids say, all I got to do is wash off afterwards and I'm good. Or, kids say, look, I don't really need to worry about this because I assume that that's my partner's responsibility. Or, I'm pretty sure we had a conversation about this, but then we just kind of got into it and didn't. Even when they're armed with information, it can make it really difficult even to act on information or remember that information in the moment. A lot of us get a little bit, ahead of ourselves when we're in romantic situations. So I just go back to, please tolerate me for just 1 second. Can we be awkward for a moment? Can I just get some of this stuff out there? You don't even have to respond. You don't even have to say, yes, that was a good idea, or, oh, I didn't know that. Just sit with me for it. Maybe it's a car ride where both of us are facing in opposite directions. Maybe we turn off video when we're FaceTiming or talking about this. Whatever it is, let me be awkward for a moment. And if they won't even let you be awkward, that's understandable. One of the things we see in surveys is that teens say that they want their parents overwhelmingly. And I should say this is, on the level of in the 60s in many surveys that we see with teens, where 60% or more will say they want their parents to be the source of information about some of these things. At the same time, they wish they didn't have to want their parents to be the source of information on these things. So there's a definite kind of yes and balance back and forth in talking to your kids about this stuff. So if they say, look, we got to shut this down, we can ask them, do you want to pause this for a moment? And we'll kind of return to this later in a moment that doesn't feel so awkward and overwhelming. Maybe while we're sitting on the, train to school and looking in a different direction, or in the car, or we're both walking and looking at like the fall foliage, whatever it might be. Or can I just send you some resources? You read them and we agree that we'll just kind of check in with each other if there are questions, or you're looking for other things a little bit later. Or if you don't feel comfortable talking with me, who in the village do you feel comfortable talking with? Can you assure me that you'll at least, speak with them? The next question is, what's the best way to teach consent beyond just saying no means no? I want my kid to really understand what healthy boundaries and mutual respect look like. And I highlighted this a bit in the first question in this episode, but consent really starts with body boundaries as young children. So teaching kids that their private parts are their private parts. There are only certain people who might be helping them to change clothes or checking them, say, at the doctor's office. And beyond that, we want them to really talk to us if anyone tries to cross that particular boundary. As we get into later childhood, as I outlined in kind of the first question, a lot of this is thinking about when people do come into contact with your child's body, and how can you make that a choice about how that contact happens, rather than just assuming that kids are okay with hugs, or they're okay with high fives, or they're okay with certain things. Teaching kids that it is their body to say how and when they want to be touched, and it is their body to say they don't want to be touched, if they would like someone to please move away from them. This helps them with peers, it helps them with adults, it also helps them to understand what are unsafe situations with adults, because if we rehearse with kids and say, look, if someone says, oh no, it's okay, and gives X excuse, I want you to know that that is something that is never applicable, or I want you to know that's something you should talk to me about. I think beyond that, we're also thinking at these ages about how we model for kids respect for other people's bodies. So they should see us talking to other people as we say goodbye or hello, like, hey, do you want me to shake your hand, or can I come in for a hug, or something like that, where they see us asking about those body boundaries with friends. If they see us, if we are co-parenting with a partner, how they see us interacting with a partner and treating them with some level of consent as well. Hey, would you like me to rub your shoulders? Would it help if I gave you a hug right now? Any number of things that we're asking about before we engage with other people's bodies. And then beyond that, as we get a little bit further on in development, when we're talking about these sorts of, as consent, I think it's really saying to kids, I know you're in your first relationships right now, or I know that you're dating your first boyfriend, your first girlfriend. There are certain things your friends might be doing. You don't necessarily need to do those things until you're ready. There are certain ways that you might, your partner might ask you to be physically affectionate. You don't have to do anything until you're ready. Your job is to just be able to speak for yourself about what those boundaries are. And a lot of kids will say, well, what are those things? We'll say, look, some partners want to hug. They want to put their arm around you. They might want to hold hands. They might want to kiss. As kids get into late middle school and early high school, there might be ways that they ask you if they can touch your body. And of course, that's up to you as to what you feel ready for and what you feel like you want to give consent to. Average age that kids might lose their virginity across the United States tends to be somewhere around middle to late high school. So what we want to be thinking about is, given that kids are maybe having their first sexual experiences those times, we don't want to be telling them that no can mean no, or that they can that we want them to be thinking about consent too late. We want to really be saying, look, some kids in your grade might be engaging in all kinds of different things related to sex, and you can decide exactly when you're ready for this. I will also say there's an added caveat where we'll often say to parents, to check in kind of with their family's values as well about these conversations, because some parents may say, look, it isn't just consent. Here's also where our family values or beliefs lie, in the sense that I want you to know that we want you to delay this until, and this is kind of certain things that families might be talking with kids about, or we think that you are too young to engage in these kinds of things. So we would ask that you rehearse ahead of time with any romantic partner that you will be saying no to these types of things. And here's why we think that you're either too young to make this decision, or it's something that should wait until a relationship gets to this stage. Any number of things that we want to make sure are folded into that conversation about healthy boundaries. And, at the same time, your own family values and what you're hoping your kids will act on. Our next question. My daughter has a boyfriend and wants privacy, but I'm still worried about safety. How do I respect her boundaries while setting reasonable rules? So, a few things that I often say in session with parents. You do not have to make it easy for your kids to engage in physical intimacy with their boyfriends or girlfriends. It is a hallmark of high school relationships in particular that, teens just have to navigate kind of like a little bit of difficulty in finding situations that can be private or they can be together for a partner. And, in reality, we may be still telling them, like, look, part of the reason why I don't need to make it easy for you is I don't know that I necessarily think that you're ready for all the aspects of physical intimacy at this age. So, as much as you might want privacy, or you might feel that you're ready for it, I am not necessarily going to tell you that I'm going to make this easy. Like lots of teens will say, why won't my parents let me come home, go to my bedroom with my partner, and just close the door? And the answer is, look, your parents may be uncomfortable with feeling like you're old enough to engage in these things. They're not saying you're never going to be old enough, but they're also not just going to agree to make their house open to you doing these particular things. They might say you can be with your partner and be, watching a movie, be cuddling, be in your room with a door open and a foot on the floor, whatever this might be, but you're still living under your parents' roof, so we got to kind of make some compromise between the privacy you want and their rules. And I'll say that to both parents and kids. Beyond that, even if we think that our teens might be finding these private situations where they might be engaging in intimacy, parents will often tell us, I'm still worried about safety. And I say, just throw it out there. If you're worried about your kid's safety, it's a really good idea to say, hey, look, I want you to know that I don't know exactly where you are in your relationship or, what you're engaging in, but in the event that you're becoming sexually active, and I know this might have come up in your sex ed course or something like that, I don't know if we've talked about it, I just need you to know a few things about how to prevent sexually transmitted infections, and I need you to know a few things about prevention of pregnancy. And I need you to be thinking about that anytime you're ever thinking you might become sexually active. Again, you might be telling your kid, I don't want you to be sexually active, or I want you to delay this, or this is our family's value to kind of do this. But it's also really important that if they become sexually active, they know how to stay safe around sexually transmitted infections, and that they know how they can effectively prevent pregnancy if they do not want to have a child. And these are things where when we look at kind of the research, what we see across the country is that when kids are given sex education that focuses away from those topics of safety and pregnancy prevention and consent, or is focused, say, on only abstinence, kids still end up engaging in sexual activity. At the same time, they just tend to be less safe about it. That's not a great outcome. At the end of the day, if our curriculum is focused, for example, on delaying sexual activity and shows no evidence that it does so, and evidence that it actually makes kids less safe, we've got to find a way to get them this information. Our second and last question. I want my kids to understand our family's values around relationships, but I also want to give them accurate information about safety and health. How do I balance both without sounding preachy? As you've heard me weave into a few of the answers earlier in this podcast, the focus is, again, on bringing it back to what your family's experiences are and trying to say to your kid, look, I'm not trying to sound like, and I just kind of want to call a spade a spade. I'm not trying to sound preachy. I'm not trying to sound patronizing. I would love to hear your perspective. I'd love to hear your input. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this. Most teens will say, over my dead body, I'm not going to let you, draw me in and have me talking about this stuff. This seems like a trap. But If you are talking to your kid about this, just call a spade a spade. Say, I know this could be awkward. I know this could be preachy. I want you to know a couple things. I want to be able to give you a bit of information, or at least, your parents' thinking about our family's values around relationships. And, that can be across all kinds of things. It can be about how you engage in a romantic relationship, what kind of consideration you want to see your child engaging in with their partner, how you want them to be loyal or faithful, how you want them to be considerate of their partner. There are all kinds of things that we transmit to our kids about how you treat a romantic partner, that are values even beyond sexual intimacy. And then there's also, of course, very important things that parents want to discuss with kids about their family's values related to romantic intimacy and having sex. So we want to be clear about those. I'll often tell parents before you go into the conversation, really try to get your talking points down to like 2 or 3 things you're trying to get across, and just say to a kid, I don't want to get derailed. I'm trying, I'm going to try to kind of blow past any attitude I'm getting or any response I'm getting, or you telling me that, this is absolutely awful or I sound preachy. I just want to get these couple things across to you. And it can be your family values about this. It can be your realism about the fact they may be encountering these situations. And then thirdly, it's that you want them to have accurate information. And if they don't get it from you, please let you give them some resources that can make sure they have accurate information about safety and health. Our last question: what should I do if my teen is sexually active, but they haven't told me? This is a tough one, because the reality is, if your teen is sexually active and you believe they have pretty good information on sex, safety, and consent, that may be a kind of toss-up for a lot of parents, where you're trying to respect a little bit of your teen's boundaries around their relationships, because you may have armed them with the information that you think they need in order to handle responsible decision-making and safety in these relationships. And if it's true that they are sexually active, that may be something where you're trying to let them know that you're trying to respect their privacy. Hey, and the way that you can do that is you can even say that explicitly. Honey, I know you're in a new relationship with somebody. I know it might come along with all kinds of confusing choices or all kinds of new experiences. And of course, at this moment, your teen is groaning. And you say, but I just want you to know, I'm always here if you want to talk to me about it, because I know that teenagers, can feel incredible in like the love bombing stage, or as you're getting past the talking phase with somebody. But I also know there are really tough parts of these relationships, tough decisions you have to make. It's also really tough as a teenager. I remember some of my hardest breakups were the ones where someone broke up with me when I was a teen, because I hadn't any experience with breakups yet. So it's some of the hardest moments in life. So it's really, you're saying to them, hey, I want to respect your privacy. I know you might be encountering some tough stuff. You're giving a few examples of what that tough stuff is. And then you're also saying, and I want to let you know that you always have an open door to talk to me. And I'll say, even in families where they're saying to their kids, listen, I want you to delay sexual activity as long as possible in line with our family's values or faith or whatever it might be, it's also really important to say to your kid, as much as I want you to be, behaving in line with our family's values or faith, I also want you to know, if you get into trouble, you can always talk to me. And for some parents, I'll even add the caveat of the consequences will always be less if you talk to me about some crisis that you're in or some way that you're feeling like you're in trouble than having me find out about it on my own. You're not promising that there won't be some sort of consequence. They might be grounded, or there might be, some resetting of boundaries. But one of the things that's a major risk factor for teens, in terms of their own safety, and this goes back to teens who might be struggling with depression or suicidal ideation or things like that, is feeling like they're trapped, is feeling like in some way they can't talk to their parents or can't talk to anybody who might be a mental health support about situations that they're encountering. And these are the situations we want parents to say, look, if it's a romantic relationship, if it's something online, if it's something where you feel like you're being, pulled into something on social media, or someone is, trying to kind of like, blackmail you or something like that, with something, you can talk to me about it. Please know you can talk to me about it. I will try, if you approach me, to kind of manage my own emotions and talk you through that situation. But I would always much rather you come to me than try to handle something that you feel like is just an absolute crisis, just all by yourself. That is one of the most valuable things that you can say to your kid. And with that, we will conclude the Q&A episode on sex, consent, and safety. Please, for more information on these topics, feel free to listen to last week's episode with Dr. Angela Glimp CEO of Pure Health Exchange. And in the meantime, if you've got future questions, don't worry. We got episodes on teens coming up. We got episodes on all kinds of different developmental challenges where you might be able to fold those questions into those other topics. And thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for sending in all of your questions, and thanks so much to our engaged, thriving kids, listeners, and podcast community. If you're looking for more guidance on how to start and sustain healthy, age-appropriate conversations about sex, safety, and consent, you'll find helpful resources linked in our show notes and at childmind.org. Next week, I'll be joined by our very own Dr. Kimberly Alexander here at the Child Mind Institute to talk about navigating the holidays, from managing stress and family dynamics to creating meaningful traditions that support kids' mental health. If you have a question for a future Q&A episode, reach out on our social pages or email us at podcast@childmind.org. I'm Dr. Dave Anderson. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.